The year was 1884, and for Miriam Vale, time had thickened like clotting blood. 2 winters had passed since the illness had taken her husband, Samuel, and then their daughter, young Elsie, leaving Miriam steeped in a silence so heavy it seemed to weigh down her very soul. She lived alone on a modest plot at the ragged edge of Dustmere Hollow, a town whose name echoed with irony. There was no mercy in Dustmere, only harsh judgment, dry and bitter as the cracked soil that lined its one wind-blown street. The land stretched in an endless canvas of dust and ash-gray brush, unforgiving and joyless. It offered no softness. It demanded sweat for survival. Miriam's existence had shrunk to the tight contours of her loss. Her days ticked by in a grim rhythm of routine, chores that dulled the sharpest edges of sorrow, and movement that kept her mind from sinking too deep into the emptiness. She was up before the light each day. As the sky warmed from black to pearl, she'd already be at work, kneeling in her hard, dry garden, fingers combing the reluctant earth. She mended what was torn, scrubbed what needed scrubbing, preserved what little grew. Every task was a ward against memory, a way to silence the echoes of Elsie's giggle and Samuel's gentle hum. In the eyes of the town, she was a wraith in black, veiled in mourning that seemed to have no end, and they left her to it. Their sympathy felt like intrusion, their prayers like chains. So she remained on the outskirts, never spoken to, never invited. A shadow of herself, floating through a world she no longer recognized. Her isolation wasn't loneliness. It was armor. She had built her own walls, invisible but immovable. Within them, she was safe, from pity, from gossip, from the cruelty Dustmere reserved for anyone who didn't fall in line. And that cruelty was sharpest when turned toward the Kiowa. They were reminders of a past the settlers had tried to erase, people who'd once lived freely on the land before fences and deeds carved it up. Now, the townsfolk saw them as ghosts they didn't want haunting the edges. Slurs were flung at them like spittle, and they were treated with suspicion, contempt, or open hatred. Miriam heard the muttered venom during her rare trips to Dustmere's general store, for sugar, for kerosene, for thread. She kept her eyes low and her steps quick, aching to finish and retreat. Her grief had become its own separate world, too large for her to carry and too personal to share. But one hot afternoon, all that changed. She'd gone into town to replace a cracked kerosene lantern and restock her needles. The sun pressed down mercilessly, the street shimmering with heat. That's when she heard shouting. A crowd had formed outside the general store, tight, angry, self-righteous. In the middle stood Buck Travers, the blacksmith, a broad man with a thick neck and a fondness for authority. His face was red with heat or power, it was hard to tell which. Gripped between 2 of his cronies was a girl. Thin, barefoot, not more than 15. Her expression was blank, but her wide, dark eyes trembled with fear. She had the sharp, unmistakable beauty of the Kiowa. She stole it. A woman shrieked, face pinched with rage. An entire sack of flour, right off my wagon. The girl said nothing. Miriam didn't know her name yet. Only later would she learn it was Taya. But she could already see this girl's silence wasn't weakness. It was dignity. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't begging. She just stood there, small and shaking, but not broken. "We've got rules in this town," Buck bellowed, turning to the watching crowd like a performer to his audience. "And rules don't bend just cause someone don't look like us. 10 lashes. Let that teach her and the rest of em." A gasp swept through the townsfolk, a mix of horror and agreement. 10 lashes was a brutal sentence. Enough to cripple a grown man. For a girl this size, it could kill. Miriam felt her stomach churn. She looked at the girl, at Taya, and something cracked open. In those frightened eyes, she saw her daughter again, alone, frightened, looking for someone to stand beside her. A jolt moved through her. Something ancient, maternal, alive. Before she knew it, she was stepping forward. The crowd parted in silence, stunned, as the widow they'd all forgotten stepped into the center of their spectacle. Miriam's boots struck the ground with deliberate weight, the hem of her long black dress brushing against the dust. The murmurs of the crowd quieted like wind smothered by thunderclouds. Buck Travers frowned, clearly thrown off by her intrusion. "Miriam," he barked, voice thick with confusion. "This ain't none of your concern." But she didn't stop. Her veil was pulled back, eyes locked on the girl. Taya's arms were restrained by two townsmen, and even now, with her fate announced, she stood frozen like prey before the knife. "It is my concern now," Miriam said, voice low but clear, laced with something that sounded far too much like command. The blacksmith narrowed his eyes. "You don't know what she's done." "I know she's a child," Miriam replied. "And you want to whip her bloody in the sun." "She stole," Buck growled, gesturing to the flour sack lying beside the wagon wheel. "She took food," Miriam said. "Because she's hungry." "That's not theft. That's survival." Someone in the crowd muttered, "Let the law decide." But Miriam turned slowly, sweeping her gaze across the faces around her. People she'd known for years. Men who had once shaken her husband's hand. Women who had brought bread when Elsie was born. Now they stood by, silent, watching, waiting for blood. "I'll pay for the flour," Miriam said, reaching into her satchel. She pulled out a pouch, light from coins, but heavy with meaning. She'd been saving it, quietly, for reasons she couldn't even articulate until now. "And if that's not enough," she continued, stepping closer, "I'll take her punishment." That stopped everything. Even the dust seemed to freeze midair. "You what?" Buck's voice cracked, incredulous. "I said, take me instead. 10 lashes, wasn't it?" She held her arms out. "Then do it." A woman gasped. A man at the back whispered, "She's lost her mind." Miriam didn't flinch. For a long, unbearable moment, Buck stared at her, jaw twitching. He looked from Miriam to the girl, to the waiting crowd, now unsure. Hungry for spectacle, perhaps, but not this. Not a widow offering her own back. He scoffed. "To hell with this." He motioned to his men. "Let the girl go." But one of them started. "I said let her go," he barked. They released her. Taya stumbled forward, dazed, knees buckling. Miriam caught her before she hit the ground. Buck spat on the dirt. "Take her home if you're so desperate to play savior. But if she's caught again, I won't be merciful." Miriam didn't answer. She wrapped her shawl around the girl's thin shoulders and turned her back on Dustmere. They walked in silence through the heat and wind, past dry fields and the buzz of unseen insects. The town faded behind them like a bad memory. Taya didn't speak. She only walked beside the woman who had just given up everything for her. When they reached the wooden steps of Miriam's cabin, the girl hesitated. "You're safe here," Miriam said softly. Still, the girl didn't move. "What's your name?" Miriam asked. The girl's lips parted. "Taya." Miriam nodded. "I'm Miriam. You can rest here. You don't have to explain anything. Not unless you want to." Taya stood there a moment longer, and then, slowly, she climbed the steps. The inside of Miriam's cabin was humble and worn, but clean. A stone hearth stood at its center, its ashes swept and wood stacked neatly nearby. One corner held a small bed, another a rocking chair. Sunlight filtered through hand-stitched curtains, painting gold patterns across the wooden floor. Taya stepped inside slowly, glancing around as if waiting to be struck. Miriam noticed the way her shoulders stayed tight, even after the door closed behind her. "You hungry?" Miriam asked, moving toward the kitchen shelf. Taya gave the faintest nod. Miriam heated a tin of beans over the stove, sliced what was left of her cornbread, and poured a bit of well water into a clean tin cup. She said nothing as she set the plate down before the girl. Taya didn't thank her. She just ate, silent and fast, like someone used to hiding meals. Miriam didn't press her. That night, she laid out a quilt beside the hearth for herself and let the girl take the bed. Taya hesitated, clearly torn between suspicion and exhaustion. But eventually, she collapsed into the mattress, curling into herself. As the fire crackled low, Miriam lay on her back, staring at the wooden beams above her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Dustmere would be watching now. Whispers would spread. Questions would rise. But as she listened to the soft breath of the girl sleeping nearby, Miriam felt a stillness in her chest she hadn't known in years. Days passed. Taya spoke little, but her presence slowly became part of the cabin's rhythm. She helped with chores, gathering kindling, drawing water, pulling weeds. She never asked for anything, never complained. Her silence wasn't cold, it was cautious. Wounded things don't speak quickly. Miriam began to notice the small things. The way Taya ran her fingers along the edge of the windowsill, as if memorizing it. The way she watched the trees, always alert. The way she flinched at loud sounds. One afternoon, Miriam found her in the garden, crouched beside a half-dead squash plant. You can talk to them, if you like, Miriam said gently. Plants, I mean. Taya looked up, surprised. Samuel used to do that, Miriam continued. Said it made them feel less alone. Taya stared at the plant, then whispered something in Kiowa. Words Miriam didn't understand, but recognized as sacred. Later that evening, Taya brought in a bundle of wildflowers and placed them on the mantel without a word. Miriam smiled but didn't comment. The silence between them was no longer hollow. It had shape now. Trust, slowly forming like dew before dawn. But trust is never unnoticed in towns like Dustmere, and it doesn't take much for whispers to turn into fire. By the second week, Miriam could feel the town watching her like wolves at the treeling. She hadn't returned to Dustmere since the incident outside the store. She didn't need to. She knew what they were saying. The whispers she could practically hear in the wind. The widow's lost her mind. Taking in a thief. A savage's child. She'll get herself killed. Miriam ignored them. But the eyes of Dustmere had long arms, and eventually, one of them came knocking. It was Sheriff Coyle, riding up to her fence with the grim patience of someone who didn't want to be there, but was sent anyway. He dismounted slowly, tipping his hat. Afternoon, Miss Vale. Miriam stood on the porch, arms folded. Don't suppose you've changed your mind about that girl? She has a name, Miriam replied. It's Taya. Coyle sighed. You know folks in town are talking. They think you're harboring trouble. She's not trouble. She's a child. Maybe, he said. But her people. They're not her people. They're people. The sheriff scratched his beard, clearly uncomfortable. I'm just here to say, there's concern. And concern turns to fear. You understand. Miriam's stare didn't waver. Coyle looked at her for a long moment. Just be careful. He turned and rode off, dust trailing behind him like a warning. That night, Miriam double-checked the locks on her doors. She wasn't afraid of the Kiowa. She was afraid of Dustmere. But when fear came knocking again, it wasn't from the town. It was the sound of hooves in the night. Not just one. Dozens. Quiet. Measured, like shadows crossing the earth. Miriam woke with a start, Taya already standing at the window, alert as a deer sensing the wind change. They're here, Taya whispered. Miriam rose, heart pounding. Who? Taya didn't answer. Instead, she stepped onto the porch, barefoot and steady. Moonlight poured over the yard like silver dust, and standing just beyond the tree line were horses. Warriors. Their faces were marked in sacred paint. Their spears and rifles glinted in the pale light, unmoving. Dozens of them, silent and still, like statues carved into the earth. Miriam stepped beside the girl. What's happening? Taya didn't speak, but one of the warriors rode forward. His horse didn't make a sound. His eyes locked on Taya. Then he dismounted. He didn't speak, but he reached out and gently placed his palm on Taya's forehead. A quiet blessing. Then, he looked at Miriam. There was no threat in his face, only something deep, heavy with gratitude. Without a word, he turned, mounted his horse again, and disappeared back into the woods. The others followed. Like smoke, they were gone. Miriam stood in stunned silence. Taya exhaled, a tear slipping down her cheek. You're not alone anymore, Miriam said softly. And in the quiet that followed, Taya finally nodded. By dawn, word had already reached Dustmere. No one saw them leave, but someone had seen the horses in the trees. Someone else claimed they'd heard chanting. Another swore they saw a fire circle in the valley, even though nothing burned. And just like that, the town's unease twisted into panic. The Kiowa are gathering, someone shouted. They're planning something. They came to her house. She's calling them with spells. She's harboring their spy. The sheriff tried to calm things, but it was too late. Fear had already taken hold, and fear, in Dustmere, always found a match to light. A mob formed by noon. They rode up to Miriam's cabin with fire in their eyes and rifles on their backs. Men she once sold bread to. Women who had prayed beside her. Now, they came to burn what they didn't understand. Miriam saw them before they reached the fence. She stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed. Taya standing behind her, silent and still. Out of the way, Miriam, Buck Travers growled, rifle slung across his chest. We're taking the girl. No, Miriam said plainly. She's a threat. You saw those warriors. She's calling them to attack us. They came to thank her, Miriam said, her voice unwavering. Because someone finally showed her kindness. She's dangerous, Buck barked. No, you're afraid of what you don't understand. she said. That's the danger. Coyle arrived seconds later, riding hard, dismounting fast. What the hell is going on? The sheriff shouted, trying to push through the gathered men. Stand aside, Sheriff, Buck snapped. You had your chance. No one's burning anything, Coyle warned, hand on his holster. Back down. But Buck raised his rifle. And that's when Taya stepped forward. She walked past Miriam, past the sheriff, and stopped in front of Buck. Everyone tensed. But she didn't speak. She simply knelt and placed a small pouch on the ground, wrapped in cloth, tied in twine. A peace offering. A sacred gift. Buck's hands shook. She's just a child, Miriam said again, voice soft now. You were going to beat her for a loaf of bread. Now you want to kill her for being seen. Coyle looked around at the faces in the crowd, many now unsure. Buck stepped back, face dark with shame. The sheriff finally raised his voice. This ends now. Go home. All of you. One by one, they turned away. No words. No gunfire. No fire. Just silence, leaving like a tide drawn back into the sea. Miriam stood tall, the wind lifting the ends of her shawl. And Taya, still kneeling in the dust, finally rose. They went back inside together. After the standoff, the world around Miriam's cabin seemed to exhale. The woods were quieter. The air felt lighter. And though Dustmere kept its distance, no one came knocking again. For the first time, Taya began to speak. Not much. Just a word here, a glance there. But Miriam noticed the change. She asked questions about the stove, about the garden, about the stars. One night, they sat beside the fire, mugs of warm tea in hand, and Taya whispered, You remind me of my aunt. Miriam didn't ask more. She waited. After a long pause, Taya continued. She used to tell me stories. Before the soldiers came. Miriam looked at her gently. What happened? Taya's eyes stared into the flames. They came at night, looking for food, or someone to blame. Her voice was flat, but her fingers trembled. My mother told me to run. So I did. I hid in the riverbed. They didn't find me. Miriam set her mug down. I'm so sorry, Taya. The girl's jaw clenched. I didn't cry. Not once. You didn't have to, Miriam replied softly. Sometimes the pain is too deep for tears. Taya looked up at her then, eyes shining. I didn't want to trust you. I thought you'd send me back. I almost did, Miriam admitted. But I'm glad I didn't. There was a long silence. Then Taya said, The warrior who touched my forehead, he's my uncle. Miriam blinked. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to, Taya replied. His blessing means I'm no longer hunted. I'm home again. Even here. Miriam asked. Taya nodded. Especially here. That night, as Miriam lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling and felt something strange. Not fear, not regret, but peace. The kind that only comes when you finally choose to stand where others would run. Weeks passed, and though Dustmere stayed quiet, Miriam knew the silence was not peace, it was waiting. Taya had begun to smile more. She laughed, even if softly. She hummed Kiowa songs while gathering herbs. The house felt full again. But Miriam had lived long enough to recognize the weight of a storm before it broke. One morning, the smoke returned, not from her hearth, but from the trees beyond the valley. She climbed the ridge behind her cabin and saw it. A thin black coil rising into the sky. Not a campfire. Not a warning. A signal. She rushed back to the cabin, heart thudding in her chest. Taya met her at the door. You saw it. Miriam nodded. You know what it means? Taya's face darkened. It means someone has come. Not mine. Within the hour, 2 riders emerged at the edge of the woods, strangers, dust-coated and hard-eyed. They carried no insignias, but Miriam could smell trouble on them like smoke on wool. Evening, one called out. We're looking for someone. Heard she passed through here. Miriam didn't answer. The other rider dismounted, stepping toward her gate. Young Kiowa girl. Pretty quiet. Might have been traveling alone. Miriam held her ground. You won't find anyone like that here. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. See, I think we might. Taya stood just inside the cabin, still and watchful. Miriam met the man's stare. You'll turn back now. His smile twisted. And if we don't, that's when the wind changed. The trees behind them rustled, and shadows moved. One by one, figures stepped from the brush. Kiowa warriors. Not dozens this time, hundreds. Surrounding the riders in complete silence, their faces painted, their bows drawn, their rifles raised without a word. The riders froze. The lead one dropped his reins. We didn't mean no harm. A tall warrior stepped forward. It was the same man who had touched Taya's forehead weeks ago. He spoke only once. Leave. The riders didn't hesitate. They mounted fast and vanished down the path like mice fleeing fire. When they were gone, the warriors turned to Miriam. The leader nodded once, then disappeared into the trees. It was over. Taya stepped outside, the last of the smoke curling upward behind her. Miriam let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The valley was still again, but something had changed for good. The next morning, the world was hushed, as if the land itself was catching its breath. Miriam stood on the porch, watching the mist lift from the valley. The trees were still, the sky open and wide. Taya sat on the steps beside her, braiding strands of grass together. There was peace in her hands now, purpose in her silence. Will they come back? She asked softly. Miriam looked at the treeling. If they do, it'll be to visit, not to save us. Taya nodded. I'm not afraid anymore. Miriam smiled. Neither am I. For the first time, Dustmere didn't matter. Let them whisper. Let them scowl from behind their fences. Because here, on this quiet ridge above a fearful town, 2 lives had been rebuilt, not out of blood or revenge, but out of choice. Miriam tended her garden. Taya helped harvest. They read books by the fire. And at night, they watched stars trace patterns in the sky, stories older than any town, older than any name. Sometimes, riders passed through, never the same ones. But word had spread, and no one dared approach the little cabin near the ridge anymore. They called it cursed. Miriam called it home. And Taya? She stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time in her life, someone had opened a door and meant it.